Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen and welcome to part 5 of Media and Courts. So we're wrapping up this module with your final lectures and getting after that pretrial publicity question. So first we're going to talk about how we study it and look at the different research methods on how that works. And then second, we're going to determine, does it actually affect jurors' decisions? Does it matter? We know it's really important, but does it actually matter, and do we see an effect going on backed up by research and other evidence? So by way of review, just remember that pretrial publicity is defined as a debate between the right to a free press guaranteed by the First Amendment of the Constitution and a right to an impartial jury, the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution. So this is the tension that exists between free press and due process. So essentially, media reports are generated of prejudicial case-relevant information. It could be anything: an arrest, a crime happened, photos, images, texts, whatever. It can be interviews, it can be statements, opinions, facts. So this information that gets generated in media may or may not be admissible at trial. Now, who makes that decision? The judge. But it could cause a potential juror to prejudge the defendant's guilt, influencing their thoughts and kind of their preconceived notions. So the concern is that this can cause an increase in bias against the defendant and can affect pre- and post-trial guilt judgments of mock jurors. So this is a legitimate concern that the right to a free press is being forfeited to, the right to a due process or impartial jury is being forfeited to free press. That would be a really big deal because it would jeopardize our criminal justice system and cause guilty verdicts when maybe there shouldn't be. So when we look at pretrial publicity, again, by way of review, know that the case-specific kind matters the most. So the concern is mostly regarding case-specific pretrial publicity, meaning that it's news articles on the case that you would be jury summoned for. Very detailed on that case. Not the general or just a topic-based version of pretrial publicity, like another rape case or another murder that might be similar. We're talking about case-specific, kind of naturally influencing people's thoughts about the case. So that is where most concern rests. Now, in studying pretrial publicity, these are the research methods. The first is field studies. So field studies can be a number of different individual methods, things like survey research or public opinion polls. You can use a lot of different techniques to do this, like random digit dial phone calls, web surveys, person on the street interviews, all kinds of stuff. And they have sometimes more or less reliability and validity depending on how you do it. But we do these kinds of things all the time. And essentially, when we're out there talking to people in the field, we want to know what was learned about the case. First of all, do they even know about it? And then if they do, what do they know? And then finally, what kind of things did they find out? Did they get defendant details? Did they find out about evidence? Did they get statements from the prosecution? What was going on in that information? So essentially, a field study assesses the effect of pretrial publicity in actual cases by going out and talking to the public. And the things that we learn are the extent of exposure, how long this has been going on. We're going to also learn the type of information that was uncovered. And again, some of this might not be admissible at trial. And then third, we're going to get a sense of the perceptions of guilt that are out there and held in the public's eye. So this is really useful information to gather if you're trying to assess whether or not it's influencing the case. Now, you could do this in two settings to see if maybe there is enough evidence to support a change of venue. To say, hey, there's some bias going on out here in the public and my client cannot get a fair trial. This would demonstrate the need to change it to another location that maybe has less of it or no pretrial publicity. So essentially, you would do it in the area of concern, right, where the trial is scheduled or held, that location. And then you could do another venue, maybe one that you would like to move it to, a neighboring county, neighboring city, or state, and see if it's less or non-existent there, and you could see if there is cause for concern. So one thing I want to note before I move on is these types of field studies where you're out talking to the public, we cannot determine causality. Okay, we can't determine what caused the predetermination of guilt, and the pretrial publicity being so pervasive, we can't go after that cause. We just know it's there and we know that it matters, but we don't know what caused it. And remember, someone's predetermination of guilt could be influenced by lots of things. Not just the pretrial publicity, it could be influenced by the people they talk to every day, the kind of work they do, their personality, and a lot of other things that could be going on and influencing their responses to us in addition to the pretrial publicity. So there's a lot of other effects that could be happening that we have no control over. Okay, so we just have to look at what we do have control over and what it tells us. So we can't determine causality. Now the other way that we can do pretrial publicity studies is through content analyses. And this is kind of fun. If you really like staring at other people's Facebook pages, you love reading online news or looking at pictures in magazines, this would be for you. So essentially you're going to examine the information given by the media. And not only just say, is it there and what does it look like, but you're going to look at all kinds of details about it. So you're going to look at pictures. Are they emotionally invoking, more factually based? What kinds of text is in there? What does a headline say or suggest? What space does it occupy? Is it the entire front page or a cover story versus maybe something more deeper in the inside where you have to dig for it? Is it part of the front matter, right? The stuff that's going to get more attention as someone picks up a magazine or a newspaper? Or is it, again, in the back? Is it above the fold or below the fold? So in newspaper talk, this would essentially determine priority and placement by the layout staff and essentially the editor-in-chief to say, is this an important enough story that I put it above the fold? Because that's how the person's going to experience receiving the newspaper. They're going to look at that above the fold stuff first and the below the fold stuff second. So priority matters in this. But can you see how detailed we can get? And not only looking at the content itself, but looking at placement, looking at how much, looking at where it is, and so forth. So this is really cool stuff. Now you can take this in a given location or with maybe a given newspaper, a local paper, a national paper. And it's interesting to compare local news effects versus national news effects because sometimes we see these effects and other times we don't. And the coverage is so similar, it doesn't really matter. But then again, sometimes the crime is so prolific, you would have to be living under a rock to not know about it. So it would be hard to untease the local versus the national because it just is on everything, every television, every website, every paper. But essentially you would compare coverage in one area versus coverage in another. So comparing venues, this location versus this location, and seeing if there's a difference between, you know, exposure, information, placement, and all those things here versus here. Now again, pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages to doing it. You can imagine there is a little bit of subjectivity involved when you're studying content, and you have to think about that stuff. So if you have a team of people all combing through articles or Facebook posts or sharing or tweets or papers, you got to make sure they're all trained and they're working on the same criteria and following the same guidelines and identifying the things that matter and how they're going to code and operationalize everything. And operationalize is just a fancy way to say measure. How are we going to measure and observe that this is happening or not happening? Now, again, it does not allow us to determine cause. It just lets us know, is it out there and is it relevant or related to this other thing called prejudicial guilt? But we don't know what's causing it. We just know it's related to it. So remember, causation is not correlation. They are different. Now, we got to remember, too, when we're talking about determining cause, there are other influences out there. We said, well, what if someone is more conviction prone in their thoughts? And that's kind of a thought pattern that kind of jumps to conclusions. When they see someone in trouble or they see someone accused, they kind of automatically start thinking that they really did it. And they're very, less likely to believe in a frame job or in circumstantial type things. They associate smoke with fire, and that's kind of the thought pattern they have. Those people exist out there, and that might be more responsible for a rendering of a guilty verdict than maybe even the pretrial publicity was. So as researchers, we have to account for these kinds of effects that could also be going on and playing a role in this, and not be a little bit overstated or presumptuous in what we think the research and results are telling us. So let's look at the Studebaker et al. Article. And this one's interesting because it was focused on the Timothy McVeigh trial. And this is a Time magazine article. that it was just such a pervasive event, right? The Oklahoma City building was bombed. Here's the inside of the Oklahoma City building at night. I mean, the whole side of it was just completely dismantled. And this other photo of a child that was killed, nestled in the arms of a firefighter, it I know is a little bit disturbing. I actually showed it in my terrorism class, but it also was a Pulitzer Prize winning photo because the first floor of this federal building that was bombed in 1995 had a daycare, and many of the children were killed in that daycare, including this 1-year-old. And so that was kind of the photo that was worth 10,000 words. And this photo was so widely distributed after this event occurred that there was legitimate concern for a fair trial. Well, let's go back to the article. So essentially, Studebaker and her team were tasked to determine possible trial venues. So Oklahoma City was where this occurred, and then Denver was another suggested venue, and a few others. And so they looked at newspapers, okay, to say how much coverage is going on. Now you got to remember this event happened in 95 and this article was published in 2000. So this is kind of before the social media online news advent. Online news was very primitive at this time. So newspapers were kind of where people got their news, and then of course nightly news or evening news on the television and cable news. CNN was around and it was starting to really hit its stride back at this point. And you have other kind of fragmented news outlets beyond just the standard big channels on regular television programming. But essentially the study decided to just do newspapers. Ideally, what else? It can be hard to code television, and you require a lot of equipment and training to do that. So newspapers are a lot easier to work with. Does it actually matter if we use newspapers versus magazines like Time versus television coverage? Yeah, it does. But they're all telling the same story, so you could look at any one of those and ideally get useful information from it. But again, it does influence your study as to what content you're going to look at. So what did the team actually code for? They looked at the amount of coverage going on, so how much of the newsprint space was taken up by this horrific crime, and then the kind of content that was out there. So they were looking at things that were factual, things that were emotional, things that were commentary and statements versus things that were not, opinion, those kind of things. And so essentially, again, you'd have to be living under a rock to not know about this happening because of so many people that were killed in this event. So what did they actually find? They found that a change of venue was needed. Now here's the caveat. Again, living under a rock to not know about it. So it wasn't so much that they were trying to find a venue, which essentially became Denver to host the trial, that had never been exposed to it, because that simply was not going to happen. Okay, so when you have so much saturation of some prolific news story, like a terrorist attack, that everybody knows about, you can't find a no coverage, no exposure area. But what you could try to find is a low exposure area that maybe didn't have quite as much as where it happened, like Oklahoma City. And essentially that's what they found. So they found that Denver was a low exposure compared to Oklahoma City, which was exceptionally high, as you can imagine. And that public opinion was already formed on this person, Timothy McVeigh, that committed this crime. So essentially, in the content analysis, again, the detail of it was they looked at the emotional versus the factual, the placement, the amount of text, the photos, including the ones you saw, the statements made, the sources, the number of articles, and the amount of overall coverage. And they found that the more emotional content was in Oklahoma City versus factual content, other locations like Denver and the others. And this team successfully argued or used this to argue for a change in venue to guarantee due process for the accused. Now, Timothy McVeigh was still convicted, and he was still punished for this, but at least his trial followed the due process procedure guaranteed to him in the Constitution. So remember that there was near 100% exposure, and the research was really finding a lower exposed venue. So sometimes that's where you end up in trying to deal with these embedded problems with different events. The final research method we're going to look at is lab studies. So lab studies are kind of cool because we can control things a lot better, right? We can contain effects and isolate effects much more so that we get a much better sense of cause. So we really like lab studies because we can determine cause, having so much control over everything, and really answer the question, do groups in the lab, a control group and an experimental group, really give different verdicts? Now, the criticism of lab studies, because every research method has advantages and disadvantages, strengths and weaknesses. The criticism of lab studies is it's in a lab, it's hypothetical, it's not real. Is it reality? You know, how realistic can it be if it's in a lab? People might be modifying their behavior because they know they're in a study, and you have to think about stuff like that. So that is a concern, but again, we can understand cause a little bit better and try to make things as real as possible. So this is essentially how a lab study would work. You have a pretrial publicity group, okay, that would basically be exposed to all that media coverage. Then you would have a group that's essentially your control group, right? A group that was going to work on the same case but didn't have all that media coverage. Okay, so one comes in loaded, that's the experimental group, and then the control group doesn't receive all that loaded exposure, and we're going to see if there's a change. So essentially, they both receive a trial stimulus experience, some kind of a mock trial on a case, and where they're brought through the same experience together. And then eventually, we look at their guilt ratings. They make a determination of guilt, they submit it to the team, and we see if the guilt ratings are higher or lower for one group versus another. And as you can imagine, our prediction would be that the guilt ratings would be higher for the pretrial publicity group because they're coming in with this loaded mind, right, of all this exposure. But let's just walk through that one more time, just so you can get a sense of how this works. So again, we have a pretrial publicity group that received exposure via the media about a case. We have another group that's going to participate in the same lab, same case, but did not get that media exposure. They both experience a trial stimulus or a little scenario where they're taken through a trial and all the same motions of it, and essentially they're asked to render a guilt rating on that defendant. And we're going to compare the ratings of one group versus another. So, does PTP affect jurors' decisions? After all this research and all these studies, labs, field studies, content analysis, what do we find out? So essentially, this is what we find out. Negative pretrial publicity does influence jurors' pretrial and post-trial judgments of a defendant, of their guilt. They are much more likely to convict. And it doesn't matter if it's a criminal trial or a civil trial. They are much more likely to convict. So we know it has an effect. Now, this effect was present in lab studies. It was present in field studies. It was present in content analysis. So when you have multiple methods all going at it from a different angle that are showing this effect, we have a lot more confidence that it's really there. It's really happening. There also was a meta-analysis done with 44 different tests of the hypotheses confirmed. So they all had the same hypothesis. We think this predicts that. We think people exposed to pretrial publicity are going to be more likely to render a guilty verdict as compared to people who are not exposed to it. Same hypothesis, same test across 44 studies. Meta-analysis is a fancy word for a study of studies, pulling all the studies together to see all the results and coming up with a bottom line, some conclusive, what does all this research say together? Okay, that's what a meta-analysis is. We love meta-analyses because they do a lot of the heavy lifting for us and pulling together lots of studies, and sometimes hundreds of studies. Okay, but essentially, after looking at all the different ways this was researched, the meta-analysis found that the effect was there, so it was underscored, yep, pretrial publicity matters, but it was kind of a small to medium effect depending on the study, especially as trial scenarios in those lab studies became more realistic. So when it took details from actual cases and really tried to make the experience as real as possible, we saw the effects increase and become a lot larger, okay? But essentially, the research kind of looked like this. Out of these 44 studies, you had a 59% guilt rating, or 59% of the people exposed to pretrial publicity would say, yep, that person's guilty, as compared to 45% of the groups that did have no exposure to pretrial publicity, they would not be as likely to render guilt. And that's a sizable enough difference for it to be a concern. Okay? So yes, it does matter. Yes, we have solid research to demonstrate that it does. And then kind of we're up with, now what? Okay? So the last thing we're going to look at is one more study. I know you're like, really? Another study? Yeah, but we have to do it because this was a study that tried to pull together the best of both worlds to see if maybe one thing is being overrepresented by a certain type of method versus another. So this answers that question. So the Churanowski study in 2005 did a combination of field and laboratory methods. So what it did is it brought forward both the causal effects from the labs and the field effects that are hard to get at with the lab because it's perceived as not realistic in the real world, to say, okay, let's do a combination of these methods, both lab and field, and see if we can find the same effect between the two of them. So essentially it manipulated pretrial publicity in a remote location away from the trial and compared it to some other groups that were closer to the trial, where the trial would be located. And they looked at pretrial publicity in a lot of different formats. They looked at pretrial publicity that was pro-prosecution. They looked at publicity that was pro-defense. And finally, they also looked at publicity that was deemed more neutral, not defense or prosecution. They also included one more additional group called the natural exposure, where it was measuring the amount of naturally occurring pretrial publicity as reported by participants, nothing that was manipulated or controlled in a lab, or that was analyzed, through the field study. It was just what you're doing on your own. We're accounting for that too. So over 6 sessions, participants made judgments about the trial, and essentially the result was this. The naturally occurring people, the naturally exposed people, and the experimentally manipulated people in the lab actually had similar effects. So whether you're receiving pretrial publicity tests in a lab or you're naturally getting it out in the field, it supports the idea that field and lab are comparable. That you might see in certain studies maybe more representation of an effect in one version versus another, but yes, they are comparable. We can reconcile the two and feel confident that the research is correct and truthful. So essentially that's the answer to your question. Yes, pretrial publicity matters. So our final lecture in Module 5 is going to be determining what do we do about it? What are some strategies that we can take? And how has this changed things going forward, especially as media has changed? How do we account for these effects? And I'll leave you with that teaser. We'll see you next time.